This presentation is based on a workbook for arguments, 3rd edition, by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. We're going to look at Rule 31 from this book, which is about how to defend basic premises with arguments of their own. When you have a basic idea for an argument, it'll include some assumptions, some premises, and sometimes these premises could themselves be rejected or not immediately accepted by an audience for that argument. And so you need to identify which premises need defense, which premises need arguments of their own. When you give an argument for a premise, this is creating a sub-conclusion of an argument. A sub-conclusion is a premise that itself has an argument in support of it. Now, each logical argument has exactly one main conclusion. When we put the argument in standard form, like the argument on the right, the main conclusion is going to be the last line of the argument. In this case, the main conclusion is, therefore, the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants. However, we already have one sub-conclusion in this argument, which is line 3. Therefore, undocumented immigrants make an important contribution to the U.S. economy. This premise has already been defended because it is proven by lines 1 and 2. However, this argument includes 3 undefended premises, lines 1, 2, and 4. Keep in mind, you don't need to defend every premise of your argument. If you tried to do this, you would never find an end. It's an infinite process, potentially, because you're always going to have certain premises that are currently undefended. Basically, you need to be able to stop with premises that are likely to believe by an audience, even if they don't yet believe the conclusion. So questions to ask in this process. 1, which premises need to be defended? This is a bit of a judgment call, but the idea is if someone doesn't already believe the conclusion, what might they still reasonably accept as a premise? And then the second question to ask is, once you've identified which premises require further justification, what arguments can be given to defend those premises? So let's look at the undefended premises of this argument and see if they require additional argumentation. Those were lines 1, 2, and 4. Line 1, U.S. agriculture depends on undocumented immigrant labor. If someone doesn't already believe the conclusion, the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants, there's a fair chance they will not believe that premise. So that's something that probably requires defense. In order to defend that, you would probably want to cite data on the amount of farm workers that are undocumented, the percentage. And in fact, it's likely to be pretty high, which could help justify the claim that agriculture depends on that type of labor. But it's still an argument you would need to make. Line 2, if U.S. agriculture depends on undocumented immigrant labor, then undocumented immigrants make an important contribution to the economy. That's also something that may require defense. It really depends on how important agriculture is to the economy as a whole. And even though it is one of the larger sectors, you may not know until you look at the data what percentage, for example, of total GDP, the total amount of value produced by the economy, what percentage of that is in agriculture. That would be a way of helping to address the question of how to defend line 2. Line 4, if undocumented immigrants make an important contribution to the U.S. economy, then the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants. This too is something that needs defense because of the gap between the concept of making an important contribution to the economy and the policy solution of giving legal amnesty. And it may depend on the particular audience whether this requires defense, but it's still something that is likely to require defense in an audience that doesn't yet accept that conclusion. Now, so in this case, we have 3 undefended premises, 1, 2, and 4. We've made something of a case that each might require further justification. However, this process will end somewhere. You can't go on defending premises infinitely. So it's a judgment call. You're going to stop at a point in which you feel the premises are reasonable enough, they may be accepted by the audience. So let's look at another example, the taxes argument. There are currently 3 undefended premises, again lines 1, 2, and 4. Line 1, giving legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants makes it easier to tax their income. So this one would depend on the audience if it requires defense. It may just require a type of explanation, in fact. People, on the one hand, it may be obvious, that if undocumented immigrants are given legal amnesty, it would make it easier to tax their income. Why? Because they're more likely to report their income if they have legal status in the country. They're legal residents and workers there. And then if they're going to report that to the tax authorities, it becomes easier to tax. So if that's going to be already obvious to an audience, then you wouldn't need to defend that. But if it's not obvious, then you have to put the defense in. 2, if giving legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants makes it easier to tax their income, then it increases the amount of income taxes paid to the federal government. Again, this is one that's probably going to be obvious to most audiences, but it could require defense just if you're giving this argument to an audience that's not very familiar with reasoning about tax policy, things like that. Let's move on to line 4. If it increases the amount of income taxes paid to the federal government, then the U.S. should give legal amnesty to undocumented immigrants. This is really the premise in most need of defense here, because there's a big logical gap between saying that this policy would increase the amount of income taxes paid to the government and the claim that therefore the U.S. should give legal amnesty. Because there's a lot of competing considerations to consider when deciding on a new policy. In general, it's reasonable to suggest that a policy has a reason in favor for it if it increases income tax, but there's definitely competing considerations. So it's not the goal of government to just maximize tax revenue. There's other values that you're trying to provide for, like for the economy and things like that. So you definitely would need to defend line 4 with additional argumentation. Here are some tips for developing arguments. First, focus on premises that are controversial, that are not going to be obvious, that the audience may not accept. Second, the new argument you give for the premise must be more obvious than the premise itself. So it goes back to that concept of the order of justification in a logical argument. The premises should always be more obvious or easier to believe than the conclusion. So on the right is an example of an argument that fails this principle. All movies suck. Therefore, all movies based on comic books suck. Therefore, all movies based on DC Comics suck. This argument actually makes sense logically, so that first premise could be used to justify the second premise, which is also a sub-conclusion. And that second premise or sub-conclusion could also be used to justify the main conclusion. However, even though in a sense it logically checks out, there's another type of problem. It violates the order of justification, because your first premise, all movies suck, that is a broader premise. It's a broader claim. It's going to be harder to prove than the conclusion, which is much narrower, that only movies based on DC Comics suck. So you're starting from a premise that is less plausible, less reasonable, and then trying to argue to a conclusion that is more plausible. You want to do the reverse. Third tip, don't make a new argument for a premise that is also a sub-conclusion. So if you have a premise that is a sub-conclusion that is already being justified in the argument, in standard form, this premise would be indicated with the word therefore before it. You can't give a further argument in support of it. Instead, you have to look at the premises that are already being given to support that argument, that are being given to support that premise, and then try to justify those premises. The reason is that it breaks the logical structure of the argument to give two independent justifications for one premise. Instead, if you want to increase the amount of support for that premise, it's also a sub-conclusion, you go back to the assumptions you already made to prove it and try to prove those previous assumptions. Fourth tip, don't make a new argument for the main conclusion itself. This has the same basic reasoning as the third tip on this slide. The main conclusion already has an argument for it. That's the main argument that you're giving. So when you're developing an argument, you're not giving a logically separate, a new argument for the conclusion. You're giving arguments for the currently undefended premises. If you get a new idea for defending the main conclusion, fine. Or if you get a new idea for defending a sub-conclusion, fine. But that you have to split off as a new argument for that main conclusion. or a new argument for that subconclusion. It's one that is going to be logically distinct from the argument you're already working on developing. And so it has to be analyzed and evaluated separately.